All right, welcome to webinar number 3, Stress, Depression, and Anxiety in Teenagers. Once again, welcome to this webinar. So, stress, depression, and anxiety are chronic problems among today's teens here in America. However, do antidepressants necessarily work against depression and anxiety? And what are some other ways that we can handle stress in teenagers? I'll talk about those in this webinar. In addition, we'll go into an exciting journey of neuroscience, endocrinology, and psychiatry. But before we begin, who am I? I am Vinay, Kalva, one of the co-founders of Live Well Teens. Live Well Teens is a blog that is dedicated to educating teenagers and others about issues affecting the teenage age group. We attempt to spread this information via blog posts and webinars, like the one you're sitting in right now. You can visit our website and read all of our blog posts at livewellteens.org. Anyways, about our webinars. So, in our spirit of attempting to educate teens, we have 2 different webinars to accommodate different learning styles of different people, formal and casual. The casual webinar happened yesterday, and right now you're tuned in to the formal webinar. So the main idea. So I'm going to introduce the main idea and the principal concepts that we'll be covering in the webinar, and then we'll start. So, stress can lead to depression and anxiety, but these can be solved with accurate interventions. So here's the principal concepts that we'll be covering, the roadmap, basically. So first, stress is a biological response to pressure from an external source. So we'll talk about stress itself. We'll also talk about multiple factors affecting stress and its onset. Stress has multiple side effects, how stress leads to depression, and how stress leads to anxiety, and solving stress-related issues. And another thing before we begin, a quick disclaimer. The information presented in this webinar is for educational purposes only and does not take precedence over the advice, guidance, and/or counseling of your primary care physician, pediatrician, or other medical specialist, say a psychiatrist. So, let's get started. So, what exactly is stress? Well, stress can occur on anything, but we will discuss human stress in this webinar. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, stress is the way that the brain and body respond to certain demands. However, based on whichever field that you're in, the definition of stress can vary. For example, the definition of stress in neuroscience is different from the definition of stress in psychiatry or psychology. So let's discuss the 2 different types of stress, eustress and distress. The person who came up with these ideas was an endocrinologist named Hans Selye. Before you think that I'm crazy for suggesting that an endocrinologist would talk about stress, endocrinologists actually deal with the hormone with the chemical cortisol, which is related to stress. But anyways, so Hans Selye thought that some reactions to stress differ from others. Eustress is associated with, quote, desirable effects, while distress is associated with, quote, unpleasant or harmful variety of stress. So who exactly is Hans Selye? So as I mentioned, he was an endocrinologist. He was from Hungary but emigrated to Canada. He is a pioneer of research on effects of stress on the body, but is most famous for his research on general adaptation syndrome, which can be caused by stress. However, the idea that eustress and distress exist has been disputed. One paper in the journal Bioessays disputes the existence of eustress and suggests that we refer to distress as just stress, just referring to the general term. So how exactly does stress work? So there are 2 different ways that you can respond to stress: neurochemical and hormonal. So usually you will have both responses, but let's start with neurochemical. So in a neurochemical response, your amygdala detects any stressful situation. Your amygdala becomes activated, and if it's something that requires your attention, the amygdala will send the information to the hypothalamus. Then the hypothalamus will send the same information to the adrenal gland. So after the hypothalamus furthers stressful situation information to the adrenal glands, the sympathetic nervous system is activated, which triggers the fight or flight response. That is, you defend yourself against the threat or you run away from the threat. The adrenal glands, meanwhile, send epinephrine into the bloodstream. Epinephrine causes the bodily symptoms associated with stress, such as palpitations and sweating. So, what about the hormonal stress response? Well, this is different. So, in the hormonal stress response, your HPA axis is activated. Your HPA axis consists of your hypothalamus and your pituitary and adrenal glands. The HPA axis attempts to control the parasympathetic nervous system in order to calm down the brain. The HPA axis releases CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone. This hormone is sent to the pituitary gland, which then produces ACTH, or adrenocorticotropin-releasing hormone. So, once ACTH is released, it is sent to the adrenal gland, which then produces cortisol, the stress hormone. So cortisol is released as a response to stress, just note. Now, there are different factors that can cause stress. A survey from 2013 found that certain health factors affect stress. Some major psychological factors for teenagers include school, work, expectations, and social connections. But there are special factors too. We'll discuss three. After we talk about ACE score. So what exactly is ACE score? So the ACE score was based on the idea of the ACE study, which was analyzed in a paper in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. So in this study, 13,494 people received a survey in the mail. 3,586 people did not answer. But of the 9,508 people who did, these people were analyzed. And the results were interesting. More than 50% of the study population examined had at least one adverse childhood experience, and 1 in 4 faced 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. So, adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, come in many different varieties, but are all harmful. So, the ACE score is from 0 to 7 based on what type of ACEs you faced. So, these are the main 7. First, there's psychological. For example, if your parents insult you, or if you're scared of injury because your parent seems to be mad, extremely angry. There's also physical ACEs. For example, pushing, grabbing, etc., or injury-causing abuse. There's reproductive ACEs. For example, inappropriate touching, such as touching a private part or something. Another one is if you have a substance abuser in the house, for example, an alcoholic or someone addicted to street drugs, or if you have a mentally ill person in the house who is depressed or suicidal, for instance. There might also be maternally directed abuse, as in abuse directed towards a mother, or a person who has been sent to jail for criminal behavior. Based on whether or not you've been exposed to any of these 7 factors, your ACE score is given between 0 and 7. However, as with any study, there are limitations. For example, this study only used self-report, meaning that there is potential for recall bias. In addition, the potential for causality may be limited due to those with chronic illness being more likely to report ACEs. So basically, we know that ACEs are associated with these outcomes, but we don't know that ACEs necessarily cause these outcomes to occur. And there are some limitations with the ACE score itself. For example, primarily the fact that it does not account for frequency of abuse. And there are problems associated with high ACE scores. So a systematic review and meta-analysis paper in The Lancet Public Health found that ACEs were associated with many negative outcomes. This systematic review and meta-analysis analyzed 37 studies, 21 from the US, 7 from the UK, 2 from Finland, and 1 from Canada, China, New Zealand, Philippines, Saudi Arabia, and Sri Lanka each. One paper also had data from 8 different studies in 8 different countries. And here's what the researchers found. There is a weak or modest association between ACEs and physical inactivity, obesity, and diabetes. There's a moderate association between high ACE scores and smoking and heavy alcohol use, poor health, and chronic diseases such as cancer, heart disease, and respiratory problems. There's a strong association between ACEs and reproductive health risk taking, mental health problems, and problematic alcohol use. And there is an extremely strong association between high ACE scores and problematic drug use or violence. And that's not all. A cross-sectional study of 1,223 young adults between the ages of 22 and 23 found a, quote, significant direct association between ACEs and psychological distress. The General Health Questionnaire 28, commonly used to test risk of developing psychiatric disorders, was used to determine whether or not these young adults had psychological distress, as well as to examine ACEs. However, as with any study, as I've mentioned in this webinar, there are limitations. For example, because this questionnaire was given, there may have been potential for recall bias, and the role of social support may have gone unaccounted for. However, what is special about this paper is that it mentions some potential causes. Adverse childhood experiences can disrupt the brain and dysregulate stress threshold systems, causing a lifelong problem of stress. So we'll discuss some immediate and long-term consequences of stress. So here are the immediate symptoms of stress. Let's start with emotional. So some emotional symptoms of stress include easy frustration, agitation, or moodiness. You may also feel overwhelmed, unable to relax, have low self-esteem, or be antisocial with your behavior. There are also physical symptoms, such as the fact that you might have low energy, you may have headache, you may have stomach problems, and even bodily pains. There are also cognitive symptoms, such as worrying excessively, disorganization, and poor judgment and focus problems. And finally, there are behavioral symptoms, which include appetite changes and procrastination, but are not limited to these two. Well, what about lifelong consequences? I mean, after all, stress is harmful, isn't it? Well, yes, stress has lifelong consequences. We'll talk about chronic disease, sleep problems, and obesity. So let's start with chronic diseases. So this table summarizes 3 systematic reviews and meta-analyses on working hours and chronic disease. I'll first talk about what a systematic review and meta-analysis is, and then I'll talk about why I'm talking about working hours. So in a systematic review, researchers look for all available studies on a certain topic. Then all of these studies are systematically screened based on the title and abstract, and lots of studies are excluded based on these two. Then, based on these two, as well as the selection criteria that the researchers have outlined. Then, for whatever studies are left, some more studies might be excluded due to problems with their study design. Finally, whatever studies are left are then analyzed to draw conclusions. And why am I talking about working hours? Well, working hours have something to do with stress, and you'll find out as we discuss each meta-analysis in detail. So let's start with the first one. So the first meta-analysis was published in The Lancet and analyzed 25 coronary heart disease studies and 17 stroke studies. So a total of 603,838 men and women were analyzed for coronary heart disease, and 528,908 men and women were analyzed for stroke. So prospective cohort studies were examined in order to determine whether or not working hours affected stroke or coronary heart disease risk. And what they found was that working long hours increased the risk of stroke, but lower so for coronary heart disease. So the study, I'll talk about the studies examined in a little bit more detail. The databases PubMed and Embase were searched systematically, and English language prospective cohort studies, which examine how working hours affect risk of stroke and heart disease, reported CHD or stroke as an outcome. That is, does working long hours cause coronary heart disease or stroke, and included relative risk, odd ratios, and hazard ratios. For more information on those things, you should read our blog post on research. Anyways, so that was the first meta-analysis, and it showed working long hours increased risk of stroke, but less so for heart disease. But another meta-analysis published in the another meta-analysis paper published in the American Journal of Epidemiology disagrees. This meta-analysis analyzed coronary heart disease and looked for any paper with a definition of working hours and a definition of cardiovascular disease. 12 studies were examined, and the meta-analysis found that working long hours increased the risk of cardiovascular diseases, which includes coronary heart disease and stroke. And it found that the increased risk of coronary heart disease may be due to psychological stress and stress response problems. The last meta-analysis that I'll be discussing is one on cancers. So, case control and cohort studies were analyzed, 9 of them. These studies were supposed to look at the relationship between work stress and cancer and include odds ratios, relative risks, and hazard ratios with a confidence interval of 95%. Again, for more information on that, you should read our research blog post. Anyways, of the 9 epidemiological studies analyzed, 9,090 cases of cancer were reported, and there was a statistically significant risk increase for lung, colorectal, and esophageal cancer with more work stress. However, there are some limitations. There was a small number of studies, and a lot of them had differing definitions of work stress. But either way, it still shows that work stress can increase risk of lung, colorectal, and esophageal cancers. Now, as for why I'm talking about working hours and not stress. Well, working long hours increase the risk of stroke precisely because of stress. Because of a repeated stress response for the first one specifically. And for the second one, the increased risk of coronary heart disease may be due to psychological stress and stress response problems. Anyways, now let's move on to sleep. So, a study of 1,065 college students found that stressful life events could directly and indirectly affect sleep quality. However, this may have been caused by rumination. So what is rumination exactly? Well, rumination is consistently going over a thought, which is and this is common among depressed or anxious individuals. So basically, these college students might have been going over a thought of, say, I can't work hard, or I can't do my homework. And these stressful life events could directly and indirectly affect sleep quality. However, we don't know if stressful life events directly affect sleep quality. We just know that stressful life events are associated with sleep quality problems. In addition, this study relied on self-reporting, thus making it prone to common method and recall biases, which is a problem. Another study analyzed 73 college students, smaller, and 44 females were in the study. It found that the HPA axis can't function properly when one sleeps poorly. So make sure you get your sleep adolescents if you don't want to be stressed. Now, so basically, stress causes sleep problems, and sleep problems can cause stress too. Now, what about stress and obesity? I was unable to find any studies for adolescents, but I was able to find some studies for adults. So, a cross-sectional study of British men and women above the age of 4 found exposure to cortisol was associated with increased obesity. 2,527 people were tested, and the cortisol was taken from their hair. Cortisol is the stress hormone, which could be a sign that these men and women were that these men and women could be stressed due to obesity. A smaller study of 47 obese and 87 normal subjects found cortisol exposure in obese patients increased risk of cardiovascular disease. In this case control study, obese patients had higher levels of hair cortisol than overweight or normal subjects. Now, neither of these studies neither of the papers had an explanation as to why, as far as I read them. But one potential cause may be the fact that there is fat stigma. There is a large amount of fat stigma in America, and fat stigma may have caused the obese subjects to be a little bit more stressed, to have social stress. Now, how does stress exactly affect teenagers, though? These are some of the common symptoms of stress in teenagers. headaches, sleep problems, educational problems, negativity. Oh, and by the way, the minus is supposed to be the red bar is a negative sign. Irritability and worry, which is why that guy's red. Social isolation, illness, and focus problems. So I mean, it makes sense because if you're stressed, you can't necessarily focus on something else. You're only focused on your problems. Now, let's talk about stress in LGBTQ plus teenagers specifically. So, to put it simply, if someone is LGBTQ, they either have a romantic relationship with someone of the same gender or are unsure of their gender. But anyways, a report by the Human Rights Campaign explains challenges faced by LGBTQ plus youth. 76% of LGBTQ plus youth can't be quote unquote themselves at home. And 75% of LGBTQ plus youth, that's 3 out of 4, have unsupportive families. LGBTQ youth have higher rates of depression, anxiety, alcohol and drug use, and low self-esteem. And 77% of LGBTQ youth in a survey had felt depressed in the past week. Solutions. So, there are many ways to solve stress, but one of the best ones is using problem solving. According to the Mayo Clinic, you should look for a problem, think of solutions, and act on your plan. But that's not where you should stop. After you act on your plan, you should reflect on it and think about how you could improve it. And these are some other solutions. You should be positive, assert your opinions, and exercise regularly, as these have all been shown to improve stress, shown to help with stress. In addition, you should also eat healthily, manage your time properly, and get social support if necessary. You may also want to consider visiting your psychiatrist or psychologist for more assistance. Anyways, I'm going to give you guys a break because that's a lot of content to absorb. So you can get a drink, you can get a snack, you can even finish your notes, and we'll resume in 2.5 minutes. But please do not get stressed during this time. All right, I hope you enjoyed that 2.5 minute break, which was unnecessarily precise. But, anyways, we'll move on. So, what is depression? So, depression can be described as a feeling of sadness that doesn't go away. Thanks to my a quick shout out to my health class. But if you want to be a little more neurosciency, depression can be described as a lack of serotonin in the brain. Anyways, depression is also called a stage of grief and can often occur as a result of stress. Anyways, many areas of the brain are actually involved in depression. Research has shown that depression changes blood flow in parts of the prefrontal and cingulate cortexes, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the striatum, and the thalamus. However, most of the research on depression has focused only on the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. So, how exactly does stress lead to depression? Well, there are different theories as to how that happens. Well, however, an article from the journal Molecular Psychiatry explains how it's possible. So, chronic stress can cause P11, which is a protein that assists with neurotransmitter transport, to be selectively lost in some neurons in the prefrontal cortex. This could be a cause of depression. SSRIs and TCAs, two antidepressants, supposedly address this. We'll talk more about what SSRIs and TCAs are when we get to antidepressants. But anyways, this is the cycle of depression. So, a stressor might cause you to become depressed. And when you're depressed, you face physical symptoms, such as fatigue and low energy. You use low-quality coping skills to deal with your physical symptoms, which cause you to temporarily feel better. But then bad things start piling up, and you start feeling guilty and hopeless, which then causes you to become depressed again. So, what about depression specifically for teenagers? There are many different changes that come with teenage depression. We'll talk about them in context of two categories, emotional and behavioral. So let's start with the emotional consequences. According to the Mayo Clinic, teenage depression can come with feelings of sadness, frustration, or anger, feelings of hopelessness, emptiness, irritability, or annoyance, as well as loss of interest in one's enjoyable activities. This is common among people who are depressed. In addition, teenage depression may also come with low self-esteem and feelings of worthlessness or guilt. There are also behavioral symptoms too, such as tiredness, insomnia, appetite changes, and agitation. For behavior. Anyways, what about antidepressants? So antidepressants are commonly used to treat depression. This table summarizes the four most common types of antidepressants. This is a lot of text to read, so I'll go through it with you. So, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, are the most commonly prescribed, as they are safe and have fewer side effects than older antidepressants. How they work is they prevent serotonin from being reabsorbed in the brain. That's what reuptake means. Reuptake is basically another word for reabsorption. Some common brands of SSRIs include Celexa, Lexapro, Luvox, Paxil, Prozac, Viibryd, and Zoloft. Serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors work similar to SSRIs, except this time they prevent serotonin and norepinephrine from being reabsorbed in the brain. Some examples include Cymbalta, Effexor, Fetsima, Pristiq, and Savella. These drugs can also be used to treat chronic pain, which is another cause of depression. Tricyclic antidepressants, or TCAs, are an older drug from the 1950s that prevent both serotonin, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine from being reabsorbed. So basically, they do the same job as SNRIs, except they also prevent acetylcholine from being reabsorbed in the brain. Some common brands of TCAs include Anafranil, Ascendin, Elavil, Norpamin, Pamelor, Sinequan, Sormonto, Tofranil, and Vivacto. And finally, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So MAOIs prevent monoamine oxidase, an enzyme, from metabolizing neurotransmitters. This prevention allows neurotransmitters to be artificially increased. Well, the number. Some common examples of MAOIs include MSAM, Marplan, Nardo, and Pernate. However, there is one unique thing about MAOIs, which is that you should never consume them with foods high in tyramine, because when you do, your blood pressure can be raised to a lethal level. Thus, when MAOIs are prescribed, doctors usually recommend that you do not consume foods that have high amounts of tyramine to prevent this. But in general, if you are depressed, the first drug that your doctor, psychiatrist, or psychologist might prescribe you with is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or SSRI. Sorry. Anyways, what about side effects of antidepressants? So, antidepressants, like any other drug, has side effects. So, SSRIs can cause nausea, insomnia, nervousness, tremors, and dysfunction of reproductive organs. SNRIs can cause nausea as well, in addition to drowsiness, fatigue, constipation, and dry mouth. TCAs can also cause constipation and dry mouth, but can also cause blurry vision, drowsiness, dizziness, and weight gain. However, in some cases, using TCAs can cause you to have an irregular heartbeat, a low blood pressure, and have seizures. Whoa. And finally, MAOIs can cause nausea, dizziness, drowsiness, insomnia, and restlessness. So let's talk about the gender gap in depression rates. It turns out among adolescents in 2017, according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, females had a depression rate almost 3 times higher than males. The rate for males was 6.8%, and for females it was 20% of the adolescents surveyed. That means of the adolescents surveyed, 1 out of 5 female adolescents had depression. And it turns out 3.2 million adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17 had a major depressive episode. However, 60.1% of the adolescents in the survey went untreated. Now, let's discuss depression among LGBTQ plus teenagers. So, just for review, LGBTQ plus describes anyone who is unsure of their gender or is in a relationship with someone of the same gender. Anyways, adult samples show that LGBTQ plus individuals have higher rates of depression and mood disorders, although this is not applicable for youth when it comes to depression. Now, let's talk about solutions. Now, so there are 3 main solutions that we'll be talking about, shown here. So, cognitive behavioral therapy, regular exercise, and plant-based diet are some of the best. Let's start with cognitive behavioral therapy. So, CBT is a way to respond to emotions more effectively. So, I'll give you an example of a situation to make it easier to understand. So, let's say that I have depression and I go into a clinic and I talk to my therapist. So, my therapist is going to administer cognitive behavioral therapy. So, what he or she will do is teach me how to handle my emotions in a certain situation. So, if I'm depressed, then what the therapist will ask me to do is to think about something positive so that I can stop being depressed. So, or to find a way to respond to the emotion that will not cause me to be harmed, that will not cause me to remain depressed. So that's how CBT works. And it turns out, according to a paper in the Harvard Review of Psychiatry, cognitive behavioral therapy is extremely effective at helping people to not be depressed anymore. However, it recommends that internet-based CBT may also be effective at reducing depression rates, which means even if you're depressed right now, you could still get treatment. However, I would recommend you get regular exercise and consume a plant-based diet. Exercise has been shown to help with depression. A systematic review of 4 meta-analyses found exercise was effective at helping to treat depression without side effects in both children and adolescents. And while there has been lots of research showing that exercise is effective for depression in adults, there hasn't been that much for children and adolescents. Well, what about diet? It turns out a prospective study of 3,040 adolescents found that healthy diet could benefit mental health, which includes addressing depression problems. And a systematic review of 56 studies found that healthy foods such as olive oil, fish, nuts, legumes, dairy, fruits, and vegetables help with depression. However, the reason I mention a plant-based diet is because eating a diet high in plant foods has been shown to be beneficial for your body. And we'll end with depression with a note on Johann Hari. So some of you may have heard of Johann Hari, but if you haven't, he's a famous journalist who has 2 TED Talks and has written books on addiction, depression, and anxiety. His theory of depression is that social connection can help those with depression, and that antidepressants should not be used. And his theory is that antidepressants should technically not be legal, but they are, because the FDA certifies drugs in a quite awkward way. So the FDA needs 2 studies showing that a drug is effective, even if it's only modestly or a little bit. But what that means is, if there are 100 studies on antidepressants and 98 show that antidepressants don't work, the FDA will only consider the 2-study requirement when approving the antidepressants for use. But anyways, if you want more information on his theory, you should read his book, Lost Connections, and listen to his TED Talk about depression and anxiety. Okay, so we'll have another break because that's a lot of information to consume. So if you need another drink of water, if you need to eat another snack, or if you need to finish up your notes again, then please do so in this 2.5-minute break. All right. Our 2.5-minute break is over. I hope you enjoyed this awfully precise break. But anyways, we'll talk about anxiety now. So, first things first. Please do not get anxious in this section. And second, anxiety is not fear. Fear and anxiety are 2 different things. Fear is a survival response that elicits a defense response in you. That is, if a tiger is running after you, you are scared. That is fear, so you run away. Anxiety is triggered by anticipation of unpredictable threats. So basically, to summarize, let's say that a tiger is running after you. If you are scared and you run away, you are not going to be worried about the height of the tree next to you or whether or not that goat over there is eating grass. Anxiety, by comparison, is your anticipation that a tiger is going to chase after you, and your response to that is to run away, even though there's no tiger. And anxiety can be described by a range of different disorders, including generalized anxiety disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. We'll discuss them in more detail later. But what about anxiety in the brain? There are many different cognitive models of anxiety in the brain. However, an opinion paper in the journal Trends in Cognitive Sciences probably explains explains two perspectives best. So, before we talk about those two perspectives, I want to explain the definition of attention bias. So, let's go back to the tiger example. If you're running away from the tiger, your attention bias will be on the tiger running away from it. As I mentioned, you will not be focused on the height of the tree next to you or whether or not the goat is eating grass. You have an attention bias towards the tiger. So, anyways, now that I've explained attention bias, let's talk about the two perspectives. The first perspective is that people with high levels of this attention bias, high levels of anxiety have an attention bias towards threat, which drowns out other things. And reducing this would lessen anxiety. However, if you follow a cognitive motivational framework of the second perspective, then the first theory is untrue, because anxious individuals can show no attention bias at some times. So which one is true? That's up to you for you to decide. So anyways, different parts of the brain are involved in anxiety, but we're going to discuss three of them. So we'll talk about the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus. Just a quick note, the hypothalamus and the amygdala do not look like ovals. However, the reason the hippocampus looks like a crescent is because that is similar to the shape of the hippocampus in the brain. But anyways, let's first talk about the amygdala, because the amygdala is one of the most important parts of your brain when it comes to anxiety. Because the amygdala is what is primarily involved in anxiety disorders, and in activating it can cause blockage of anxiety responses. So basically, if I come up to you and if I put you in a scanner, and I notice that your amygdala is reacting, but then I find some way to turn off your amygdala, then your anxiety response will stop. As in, you will not respond if I make a tiger run after you, or if I make you anticipate that the tiger is going to run after you. But anyways, what about the hippocampus and the hypothalamus? Well, the hippocampus is required for memory and spatial navigation, and is implicated in anxiety disorders as it controls your emotions. Your hypothalamus, by comparison, also manages memory, but also manages emotion and sensory information. There is a pathway between the hippocampus and the hypothalamus that passes through the amygdala. When neurons in this pathway misfire, you will feel anxious. So, in summary, your amygdala detects danger, neurons misfire between your hypothalamus and hippocampus, and then you feel anxious. So how exactly does stress lead to anxiety? Well, this is the cycle of anxiety. So a stressor might cause you to think in a biased way. So you might, which can cause a negative self-thought. This negative self-thought causes you to seek out negative information, your confirmation bias. Then, after you seek out this negative information, you feel worse. So you attempt to suppress your emotions, either emotionally or physically. However, this suppression is short-lived, and then this might dishearten you and cause you to have more biased thinking. So now let's discuss different anxiety disorders. So there are many different anxiety disorders, but we will do another webinar just on these because obviously we can't discuss several anxiety disorders in one webinar. So I'll just discuss each anxiety disorder that we'll be talking about briefly, just so you can get basic understanding. So here are some examples. Agoraphobia. So agoraphobia is fear of open spaces. Agoraphobics avoid wide open areas like rural areas, open roads, or open pastures because it causes them to panic. Next is generalized anxiety disorder, which most people would call anxiety. It is characterized by excess worry that is out of proportion to reality. However, GAD often occurs with other disorders and or depression. Panic disorder is when you is characterized by repeated bouts of sudden anxiety, and feelings of doom are common. If you are experiencing a panic attack, you may feel chest pain, heart palpitations, or sweating. Next, there's selective mutism. Children with selective mutism don't speak in certain scenarios, which can interfere with their schooling, work, and socializing. Next, there's social anxiety disorder, which is fear of social situations. If someone has social anxiety disorder, They might be scared to socialize with others because they're scared that their peers might view them in a negative way. And it often occurs with high levels of anxiety. There are also specific phobias. A major anxiety. This only occurs during exposure to one specific thing. So common symptoms of anxiety disorders include restlessness, a sense of doom, and hyperventilation. However, some other symptoms may vary by anxiety disorder. Now, what about anxiety medications? Well, most medications for anxiety are similar to those for depression. So here are the common types of anxiety medications. As you can see, 3 of them are antidepressants: SSRIs, SNRIs, and MAOIs. Benzodiazepines and buspirone are used exclusively for anxiety. So benzodiazepines, as I mentioned, is used exclusively for anxiety. It increases the effects of certain neurotransmitters in the brain, so that you can feel happier. Well, so that you can stop being anxious. So common examples of benzodiazepines include Ativan, Klonopin, Librium, Valium, and Xanax. However, they are often used only for short-term treatment. What about buspirone? So we actually don't know how buspirone affects the brain, but the common theory is that it is thought to affect the mood chemicals in your brain. You can either get common buspirone or a version called Buspar. However, it takes several weeks to be fully effective. And then we get to side effects. So again, as with any medication, anxiety medications are not immune to criticism due to their side effects. So benzodiazepines. So benzodiazepines can cause confusion, vision problems, headaches, and feelings of depression. And buspirone can cause dizziness, headaches, and nausea. Ooh. Now, what about anxiety among LGBTQ plus teenagers? It turns out, according to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, 30 to 60% of LGBT people face anxiety or depression at least once in their life. This rate is 1.5 to 2.5 times higher than for straight individuals, that is, anyone who is gender conforming or has a normal relationship. A paper in JAMA Network Open analyzed the study of 385 transgender and non-binary adolescents. It found that of the 316 adolescents who told their parents about their orientation, 296 of them faced some parental neglect. 173 of them were at risk of developing depression, and 148 were at risk of anxiety disorder. We'll discuss some tips for parents later. What about anxiety solutions? So there are some common solutions for anxiety, and we'll discuss each. So 3 of the most effective ones are regular exercise, cutting your intake of caffeine, and yoga and meditation. I'll tell you why I put that later. But anyways, let's start with exercise. So a randomized controlled trial of 27 tweens found exercise was beneficial for anxiety. And another systematic review and meta-analysis of 12 randomized clinical trials found exercise to be beneficial for anxiety as well. It's even implicated in the US exercise guidelines that you should exercise as it is beneficial for depression. What about caffeine intake? So a study of 234 Korean adolescents found that higher caffeine intake is associated with higher anxiety score on a certain anxiety test. However, the study was still unable to determine whether or not higher caffeine intake actually causes anxiety score, and was taken out of the peak exam time when most Korean adolescents consumed caffeine. But either way, it's still beneficial. And finally, yoga and meditation. So a paper in American Family Physician found that mindfulness-based interventions assist with anxiety disorders without any harmful effects. And the reason there's paradise is because my thought process, because I think that when you meditate, you're supposed to think of a place in which you're supposed to think of a dream place of some sort, a paradise. And a quick note on drug abuse, just to clarify. So antidepressants can be abused like any other drug. One paper did not talked about how certain classes can be abused, but did not mention which ones. But it still mentioned that doctors should be extremely careful when prescribing antidepressants, and that better tools are still needed. But for parents, I would recommend that you watch your teens to make sure that they are not abusing antidepressants, and that you keep them in a locked cabinet so that your teens cannot easily grab them and abuse them. Now, let's just discuss stress versus depression versus anxiety. So we'll talk about the definitions, the factors causing stress, depression, or anxiety, and the gender differences. So in summary, stress is a result of pressure from an external source. Depression is a feeling of sadness that doesn't go away, thanks to my shout out to health class, or for neuroscience people, lack of serotonin in the brain. Anxiety is a sense of fear about something that does not that you anticipate to happen, but has not been shown to happen yet. What are the factors causing it? Well, stress can be caused by peer pressure, family, society, and societal perception of gender roles. Depression can be caused by harmful events and low self-esteem. And anxiety can also be caused by harmful events and low self-esteem, in addition to peer pressure and negative life-changing events. As for gender differences, women are more likely than men to have stress, depression, and all anxiety disorders, with the exception of obsessive compulsive disorder. So here's some tips about talking to your teen. So these are 3 questions that you should ask your teen. First, ask them if they've ever felt their heart racing or felt sad for a long period of time. If you know that their teen has been consistently having heart racing, that might be a sign of anxiety. If they felt sad for a long period of time, that might be a sign of depression. Another question you should ask them is, has any negative major life-changing event occurred recently, such as a loss of a friend or something? This might give you insight on what you might need to do in order to make sure that your teen does not become anxious or depressed. And finally, ask them if they need any help or support to get over their depression or anxiety. You should make sure that you remind them that you are always there for your teen, that you're always there for them, and that if they need any help, you are available. So, in summary, here are the principal concepts we discussed. We discussed that stress is a biological response to pressure from an external source. We talked about the multiple factors affecting stress and its onset, and we talked about stress's multiple side effects, including depression and anxiety. We discussed depression specifically and anxiety specifically, as well as antidepressants and anxiety drugs. And finally, we talked about solving stress-related issues and finished a note on drug abuse. So, the main idea. Stress can lead to depression and anxiety, but these can be solved with accurate interventions. So, thank you to Slides Carnival for providing not only this awesome template, but also many of the icons that were used throughout the presentation. So these are the some resources that you should use. For general information, please visit the websites of the National Institute of Mental Health, the ADAA, the American Psychological Association, and the American Psychiatric Association. So for anxiety and depression, please visit ADAA.org. For stress, depression, and anxiety, you can visit APA.org, psychiatry.org, or NIMH.nih.gov. If you need any assistance with stress, depression, or anxiety, I recommend that you visit your local psychiatrist or psychologist, who will be able to provide treatment options to you. If your teen is stressed, depressed, or anxious, you should probably visit your pediatrician and your psychiatrist or psychologist. So thank you very much for attending, and I appreciate your attendance. So Q&A session. So I would love to answer your questions. The only restriction that I have on questions is that you should not ask me any personal medical questions. Those should be reserved for your doctor, pediatrician, or psychiatrist. You may enter your questions in the YouTube chat to the right of this live stream. So I'll give you a 2-minute break in order for you to think about your questions, and then I'll start answering. All right. We're gonna start. It has been 2 minutes. Okay, so we're gonna start the Q&A session. So I've received 5 questions. So answer those first, and if you have any other questions, please just ask in YouTube chat. So the first question I received was. Okay, so the first question I received was, you just discussed the study where most of the information came from Western countries. There's an issue in the medical and psychology field where doctors are only taught to treat symptoms that appear in Caucasian individuals. How can experts work to be more inclusive in their practice and diagnose stress or depression in minorities as well? So that's a good question. So according to an article called Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Pediatric Mental Health, there are 6 recommendations provided. First, the government should name a task force to address the enormous gaps and unmet need for care for youth in general. Second, different sources of care should be evaluated, such as schools or community agencies. Third, providing decision rules to help parents identify the threshold for living a problem requiring professional mental health help. Different patterns of social and mental health problems might need to be looked at. Disparities disparities in access, allocation of outpatient mental health treatment should be filled. Negative attitudes, lack of treatment information, and financial concerns should also be minimized. Interventions such as enhanced access to medications and virtual interventions for African Americans and Latinos should be introduced. And finally, interventions to reduce negative provider attitudes towards minority youth and adoption of treatment, evidence-based treatment, should be incentivized and supported. So, yeah, that was a good question. Another question I received was long working hours increase risk of stroke? Okay, is risk of stroke indicative of physical stress or mental stress? That's also an extremely good question. It is true that increased stroke risk for physical stress in blue-collar workers has shown to increase stroke risk, and mental stress and the same thing is true in white-collar workers. Mental stress for mental stress in white-collar workers. The third question I received was about acne being related to stress and depression. This is a good question, as many teenagers have acne problems. Acne, depression, anxiety, and stress are all related to each other, and each one hurts the other. The fourth question I received was, couldn't it just be that men are less likely to admit to depression or display their emotions due to societal stress to be a man? That is actually true. Mental health disorders are not only common in women, but women are more likely to report their problems while men are not. So while currently we know that women have rates of stress, depression, and anxiety that are higher than men, this may be due to underreporting by men. So, another question I received was if I could discuss medical marijuana as a potential reliever of anxiety and whether it should be legal in all 50 states. So, medical THC or marijuana seems to be effective based on what it says here, based on what I've read. And it is for sure beneficial for insomnia, although it is not legal in all 50 U.S. states. As for use in teens and tweens, I'm not sure of the short-term and long-term consequences because there is risk of abuse and there isn't much research on the topic. So for now, I would say it's probably more effective for teens to change their diet and exercise more, but marijuana could be beneficial potentially. Okay, so another question I received was, what are the stress-causing problems among the students of age group 13 to 16, and what could be the solutions? So, what I would say is, what seems to work for adults should work for teens as well. Teens should make sure that should try to eat as many plant foods as possible. They should also ensure that they're getting sufficient exercise. What do you mean? Oh, and yeah, but why teens might be stressed? Well, there are many reasons that teens from the age of 13 to 16 might be stressed. They're just entering the teenage years, so they might not be familiar with. They might not be mature enough to make good decisions. They might get, and because they're new to being a teen, they might not know how to behave. There's also peer pressure and many issues that we talk about affect middle schoolers as much as high schoolers, or as much or even more. Okay. So for solutions, what seems to work is changing your diet, exercising more, etc. Good question. Okay, so another question I received was, can dogs help with reducing depression as well? Well, it turns out, from one article, it says, quote, specifically, pets and therapy animals can help alleviate stress, anxiety, depression, and feelings of loneliness and social isolation. Interactions with animals can help people manage the long-term mental health conditions, end quote. So basically, having a pet could help, but that doesn't mean that you need to get a pet. Okay, I'll discuss two more questions. So, are hydrophobia and acrophobia symptoms of anxiety? Are these cured by medication? Can they also be reduced by exercise and medication? Huh? Okay, so phobias are a type of anxiety, but they're not a symptom of anxiety. They're not. They're simply a type of anxiety, and I'm unsure if they can be treated by medication. I will do my research and I will come back to you. Anyways, another question I received was, is intervention a solution to these three issues? Most teenagers are hesitant to seek counselors, doctors, or professional help. So, while this is a good question, I am confused what you mean by intervention. Or if you're referring to parental intervention, then I would say yes, parents should intervene. But parents should be careful as to how they intervene, because teens may not react kindly. But either way, it would still be beneficial if teen if a parent can help. And it's okay if teens can't are uncomfortable seeking a counselor, doctor, or professional help. Parents should try their best to help their teen. Oh, I just received a question. What are plant-based food items to keep a teen awake, excluding caffeine? Well, there are none. Um, caffeine is uh, caffeine is one of the few ways that you can keep yourself awake, and I frankly don't recommend that. Oh, friends. Okay, thank you for clarifying. So, um, friends can help. Um, friends can help teens who are stressed, depressed, or anxious. It basically being a good friend would being if a friend is a good friend, having good peer environment may be helpful for assistance with stress, depression, and anxiety. Because your peers would respect you and help you. They can provide support. However, I would still recommend that even if you are anxious to visit a counselor, doctor, or get professional help, you still should, because a doctor or a counselor may be able to help you. Oh, and by the way, speaking of caffeine keeping you awake, we will be having a sleep webinar next week, and we'll talk more about that. Oh, and I did find an answer for are hydrophobia and acrophobia, fear of height, or symptoms of anxiety questions. So, phobias are generally not treatable by medication, according to the Britain's National Health Service. Um, so basically, if you have hydrophobia or acrophobia, you should probably get therapy. All right. If anyone has any more questions, I'm still available. All right, it looks like we have no more questions. Thank you very much for attending the webinar. I'll see you next time. I'll see you next week for the sleep webinar.